Hello and welcome, at least virtually, in vanabbemuseum and in this exhibition called The Making of Modern Art, which is the project I want to talk to you a little bit about to explain some of the issues around the decolonial that I think we're trying to address. And maybe in the beginning it's important to say that the decolonial for us has been a strong basis of our thinking for past years, building on the philosophy of Walter and Rolando and many other people, to try and understand what we, as a Western European museum, with a particular Western European and North American collection, largely, what we can do to contribute to the decolonial thinking and the decolonial drive that I think really occupies all our concerns, and is one of the most important developments that we might consider globally. But that development, that decolonial possibility, if you like, of how we might address the past and deal with it in the present, that decolonial possibility has to be treated very differently in very different places. And we, in a sense, as the perpetrators, as the people for whom that colonial process 500 years ago began with the journey of Columbus, we have to approach it, understand our complicity with it in a particular way. And the way that we've tried to approach it, at least partially, I think there are different ways in which we try to approach it. And I hope we can talk later about some of the other ways. But in this exhibition, how we try to approach it is through the idea of the decolonial through the demodern. So what do I mean by the demodern? The demodern is a subset, if you like, it's a category within the decolonial, which addresses particularly Western European and North American heritage, the heritage of modernity, the heritage which began at the same time as colonialism, and how that is manifested in a modern art collection. Yeah, we are, from our origin, a modern art museum. We'll see a little bit of where our origins come from in a minute. But that origin as a modern art museum also necessarily means that we're a colonial art museum. And what's interesting about museums is that those two, just like in so many other aspects, have been completely divided from each other. So what happens is that the colonial materials, the materials conquered, stolen, robbed in the colonial time, have ended up in what used to be called colonial museums, which are now called museums of world culture, sometimes still ethnographic museums. And those products which were produced by essentially the resources that were gained through colonialism and the possibilities that that gave to Western European states and later to North America, those objects are put into art museums. And this divide between the colonial museum and the art museum is something that goes right through the history of the museums essentially from their invention in wider terms than singularities in the 19th century. So here you see, right in the DNA of an institution like this, the necessity of addressing the decolonial. But in a sense, the decolonial is not enough for us in this particular place. To address the decolonial is to simply say, well, half of our history, half of our context, half of what we have experienced as a society is simply missing. It's not there, it's absent. So what do? We either replace everything that we have here with what is missing, we try and bring them together, but we still need to do something with the modern that is the other half of the story and which exists in these museums. So what I'm going to talk to you now about is an exhibition which is called The Making of Modern Art. And essentially what it tries to do is to take a position as an outsider, in a way, for a moment, just to imagine. I know it's an impossible position, but impossible positions are sometimes things that you can occupy in art when you can't occupy them in politics or in reality. So to take an impossible position, you're imagining yourself as an outsider to art and to modern art, and to looking at how it emerged, how it came about, this category of modern art, with all its silences, with all its blindnesses, with all its refusals. How did this category of modern art actually come about? And this is, I think, where I hope our story begins. And our story begins at the origin, in a way, of modernity, because the first person, I'm going to talk about a few people who made modern art possible, I would argue. Not necessarily artists in this case, because we're talking about systems and structures which go beyond the individual artist, even though individual artists were important in shaping the movement. But nevertheless, we're talking about the structures which maintained the possibility of modern art. And we begin with one character in particular, and I think one story which in a way illustrates the significance of modernity and modernism in our thinking, in our mindset. This character you will see up here is Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II is living in the Vatican in the early 16th century, so not long after Columbus set sail for the New World with his baptismal water. Not long after that, connected of course to the Catholic Church very profoundly in that journey, the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Julius, an interesting man, an aesthete, somebody who's interested in aesthetics, if not in decolonial aesthesis, at least in aesthetics. He does something which is quite remarkable, quite extraordinary, and I think still has repercussions today. What he did is he was obviously based in the Vatican, so based in Rome, and he started to see the pagan idols of the pre-Christian period, so the statues of Apollo or Zeus or Hera or whoever, started to see, or Jupiter or Hera, started to see these sculptures as having aesthetic value. Now this, for a Christian, for the previous 1500, let's say 1200 years after the Roman Empire became Christianized, was an absolute heresy. Yeah? It was breaking every boundary you could imagine. It was looking at the objects of evil, because heathenism, paganism was seen as a challenge to Christianity, but was also seen as an absolute evil, because religion deals not in relative ethics, but in absolute ethics, good and evil, right and wrong, God and devil. So in that process, these people were, Julius was taking these objects and giving them a value which was unimaginable in the previous period. So what did he do literally is he made the beginnings of the first museum, the Vatican Museum. And what he did, and this is what you see a little bit here, is he gathered those sculptures from Rome. Sometimes he was excavating them, sometimes bringing them up from lakes, because they'd often been discarded, thrown away, buried. Sometimes they'd been just chipped away and used to build little houses. Because obviously the knowledge, the technological knowledge of the Roman Empire was not surpassed until the 18th century, until modernity really got going. But the remains of that technological prowess were usable as building materials in the period of 1500 years, more or less, or more, afterwards. So he was taking those objects which were being lost or being damaged, and he was bringing them to the Vatican and putting them in the Belvedere, putting them in the top of the Vatican Hill, in a place which you can see a little bit in this painting here, outside but also inside, and starting the collection. You might see the Apollo Belvedere here, for instance. There's also a photograph in the corner, or a drawing here. This is one of the most famous of the classical Roman sculptures that still, in all art history books, is referred to. It's one of the most important images, actually, sculptural images of a human form. Yeah? Now, the fact that we even think about this as a human form, and even think about this as something which is a mark of, let's call it, Western civilization or achievement, yeah, is down to this guy. Because before, that was an image of utter evil. It was Apollo, it was a god that challenged God, the Christian God. It was a god that offered a different ethics, a different form of society to the Christian form of society. And it needed to be removed. So the museum, the Vatican Museum, the origins of the Vatican Museum, the Belvedere, are the place around the same time as colonialism starts with Columbus, that starts this idea not only of a collection, but of an idea that there was a time before Christianity which had value. Now if we think about this, it's again a radical shift in our thinking about time. Because before this, largely time was circular. It was about the seasons. It was about what crops to grow, what activities to do in particular moments of the year, whether that was Christian festivals or it was simply the agricultural cycle. The idea that one year was different from another, that there was some sort of form of, let's call it proto-progress, this idea that there was development from one year to the next, was really quite foreign to that agrarian kind of society. Now, what you have with Pope Julius is not only this enormously, sort of in a way, inspiring step, no? to recuperate the pagan idols, but he also says if they have value, then there was a time before the blackness that predated Christianity, because the Christian story up to that was everything was black, then there was light, and then everything was light. Now, there was one moment, Christ's birth, where the world changed, and then the world stayed the same. So instead of this one moment, this one transformative moment, this messianic moment, this moment of the Messiah's arrival, instead of this moment, there were moments where things changed. And this moment happened before the messianic moment. So it means that in that darkness we can start to look, we can start to see, we can start to find things, we can start to find value. Now, I would suggest, but this is of course a leap of artistic faith, if you like, but I would suggest that once you establish the idea that there was a before, it's very hard not to think there might come an after. So not only might we say that progress begins because the timeline begins. There is a before where there is value, there is a moment, the birth of Christ, but there's also then a history after Christ where things change. And then colonialism starts, and suddenly the Christians, the white Christians, the European Christians, are proved to be superior to all these other religious groups because they can go over and they can conquer them. And these two things go hand in hand, this growth. So this process of a before also indicates the possibility of an after or of a development. Suddenly this idea of progress is in the air. And suddenly this idea that you have past, present and future, and we need to think along a timeline, becomes possible. And what's really interesting, if you think about it, in terms of Western concepts of science, for instance, let's say archaeology in this case, what you see is that if we stand in 1503 with Pope Julius, and we say he invented the past, I know there are many other arguments, but let's imagine that he invented the idea of the past. And what actually happens from that moment is the past goes backwards as much as it goes forwards, even faster. Because what we get to with archaeology, even just Western archaeology, let alone the 40,000 years old civilization in Australia, let alone that, even in Western society, you get societies moving backwards. So it's no longer the Roman, but it's the Greek, and it's not the Greek, but it's the Hittite, it's the Assyrian, or it's the Babylonian, and it goes back and back and back. So time expands in both dimensions. It goes back as well as forward in the modern period. Now we suddenly have a timeline. From a circle we have a line, and the line has an arrow at the end of it, which says progress. And this is what started. So when we think about the making of modern art, and we're going to come on to what we, most of us imagine to be modern art in the sense of modernism, this has to exist before that, and I'm referring to what I'm going to talk about in a minute, before that can possibly happen. So let's think about how this birthplace of modernism, which we see as a late 19th, maybe 20th century phenomenon, how that moment is very much bound with the beginnings of colonialism and the beginnings of this idea of European hegemony with all the racism and all the patriarchy that is implied in that. Now, I'm going to switch. In the exhibition, if you were here, I wish you were, you would see the French Revolution, and we pass a number of things, but I don't really have time to lay out that whole step from Julius. So I'm going to switch is from Julius II to two characters who really come to define the modern art that we understand it, and that have a very different idea of it. And these different ideas are competing ideas which stay competing all the way until the American hegemony in this part of the world, in the Netherlands, which happens after the end of the Second World War. Those two people were a German, Alexander Dorner, and an American, Alfred Barr. These were the two people who fought to make modern art modern art. They made it. And how did they do it? What was the differences for them? Well, Alexander Dorner was living in Hanover. He was probably in contact with Walter Benjamin, more or less in contact with the German intelligentsia of that period. He was given the directorship of the Landesmuseum that's here, which used to be called the Provinzialmuseum, is now called the Landesmuseum in Hanover. And it had a collection which went right back into prehistory. Was the collection that, in a way, Julius made possible. He had that collection, and he said, let's show this collection as a series, not necessarily of objects or of archaeological remains. Let's show them in context. Let's bring them into an environment, and you see some of the drawings here of what he called style rooms or atmosphere rooms. Rooms that would give an atmosphere of the time in which those works were made. And he showed a whole span of time from the earliest collections, which go back into prehistory, in the old Provinzialmuseum in Hanover, all the way through to where he ended with is the room of the contemporary, the Raum der Gegenwart, the room of the contemporary, designed but never built until we built it here. Built and designed by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, a Hungarian modernist artist. So he had this whole sweep of time. He wanted to say that modern art, the contemporary, was both different but connected to the world that we come from. The world that we come from, which goes back to what we could talk about even as indigenous Europeans, but also goes through the period of colonialism and connects with it. In a sense, that story of that whole line, is the story that we haven't inherited because of these splits. In that story, the ethnographic objects in the ethnographic museum could have been much more easily united with the modern art objects. In that story, we might have had a different sense of history than the modern period, beginning in the 19th century with industrialization, understanding that as a break. But we might, because this is what museums do, no? They give us these timelines, these chronologies, these senses of where we come from. We might have had a different idea of where we come from. Unfortunately, he was in Hanover, and he was working in the early and mid-1930s. So you can imagine that some of his friends and some of his positions weren't so popular with the National Socialist regime that actually took over in Hanover a little bit before they took over in Berlin at the national level. So in 1936, having gone through 3 years of absurd compromise, and sometimes I have to say there's a whole question about how I feel in relation to Alexander Dorner and in terms of political compromise and what you have to deal with. Yeah? But in 1936 he left and he went to America. He went to America in 1936 when another institution bought its first work. So he arrives at a point where another story was starting. And this is actually the story of modern art. Although this still remains, so this is something that very much in our thinking of the demodern, we also would like to come back to. But the other story is the story that you'll probably read if you read about anybody, except an artist, except an individual genius artist, as the narrative is called. But if you don't only read about that in art history books, you might read about this. Alfred Barr. I'm combining the two of them. Alfred Barr. Alfred Barr is the founder of the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1929, but it's a Kunsthalle until 1936. Then it starts to make its first purchases and becomes what we understand in Western Europe, in fact in all of Europe, as a museum. In America they understand it slightly differently, but here we understand a collection. A museum has to have a collection. So it really began as a museum in 1936, that same year that Dorner arrives. Now what does Barr do? Barr does something, I mean, I wouldn't say it's as transformative as Julius, but it has a moment, kind of inspirational genius about it. What he says, remember the context of New York at the time was there's one big museum, it's called the Metropolitan Museum. If you've been to New York, even as a kid or something, to visit it, you might have been there. It's still the most famous museum in the city. And that's a universal museum that tries to collect everything and then something. So that museum was a competitive museum. And what he said He said, actually, yeah, we've got the Metropolitan, it's great and wonderful, and it has the heritage, not only of Europe, but also of the world that it tries to collect. It tries to be a universal museum. Said, but there's actually something that's going on now that's so different that it needs completely different treatment and different kinds of institutions. And that something is called modern art. That something is in its essence, different from what we know about art in the past. There's a split. And you can see in some of the diagrams, there's a nice diagram here which talks about the collection, or potential collection, because this is him trying to go to rich people like Rockefeller and Peggy Guggenheim and say, can I have some money to build a Museum of Modern Art, to make the collection? And he's got this little collection here, this little drawing here, where he defines what modern art is. And it's interesting to look. It's actually called Torpedo Through Time, because he made it into a little torpedo, and it goes through. And the original idea was that at the end of this time, those works would go into the Metropolitan. That was the way he convinced the rich donors that they could safely give to the Museum of Modern Art, because they thought, well, after 50 years or so, it's going to get into the Metropolitan Museum anyway, so we don't have to worry too much. When they needed to start giving the Picassos and things like that to the Metropolitan, they then changed their statutes so they could keep hold of them. But when it was founded, that was the idea. And what you see here is a torpedo through time, in which the Museum of Modern Art collects not modern art as in art of its time, art of this moment, but a particular kind of art. He defines it like this: French and the School of Paris, European outside Paris, Mexican and Americans. And that's it. The possibility of being a modern artist is limited to French, European outside Paris, Mexican, and we know why Mexican is there. And the Diego Rivera, not even Frida Kahlo, but Diego Rivera is probably the only reason that Mexican is there. Possibly some others, but Mexican and Americans. So it's interesting, in this diagram you also see that there are works that are made at the same time as the Museum of Modern Art, but aren't modern art. Modern art is a kind of form, an aesthetics, maybe even an ideology, I would say. We can argue about that. But maybe even an ideology which conforms to certain rules. And you can be an artist of the 1920s, the 1930s, but you don't have to be modern, at least not in Barr's analysis. So this modern art, this Museum of Modern Art, collecting modern art as a particular kind of thing, is what we inherit in this museum. Yeah? It's what we started with. Because this idea of the Museum of Modern Art, not Alexander Dorner's idea of everything being connected from prehistory all the way to the present, this idea of modern art being something totally different, totally new, cut off, is what we inherit today. Why do we inherit that today? So we inherit that today largely because of the American victory in the Second World War. Now, I think we're all very grateful for the American victory, but I would say it's also the Soviet victory and many other people's victories. But the anti-fascist victory in the Second World War is something we can be very proud about. But it had consequences for Western Europe, which essentially, much like our sisters and brothers in the central and eastern part, was then came under the influence of a different kind of power. Now, America has a very fraught relationship with Europe. Yeah, it's both its origin, but also the thing it tries to get away from. But nevertheless, in North America and the United States, that in that process, the story of Alfred Barr is the story that becomes the story of modern art. And we're going to have a look a little bit more at some details of this, but there's one exhibition in particular which is called Cubism and Abstract Art, which very fascinatingly takes the idea of arrows and progress and time and linear, everything that we talked about with Julius II, and really turns it into the story of modern art. So modern art becomes completely linked with the idea not only of progress and of time, but also of how the colonial conditions, which are still going on in the 1920s and 30s, becoming extensively extended in that period as well, that in that circumstance, it's the way that modern art became separated and could be seen to be, to put it in a very clumsy way, not guilty of the context in which it was produced. And so there I'll end it, and we'll start to look at some other parts of the exhibition. So, we've come into another room in the exhibition, the next room actually following from the introduction to the museum making of modern art. And this room really looks at how artworks became classified as art or declassified as art. What happened when something becomes artisized, becomes made into art? Because, you know, as we all know, this idea of art itself as something which, you know, my children could do, this idea of modern art as something which doesn't really deserve the category of art, because art should be something that's produced by the hand and exhibits a certain manual dexterity, manual skill, that's something which still hangs around. There's still much critique of this sort of modern and contemporary nonsense that isn't really art at all, and let's go back to a proper Rembrandt or whatever. So still, modern art is still, to some extent, on the margins now, still sort of struggling for acceptance as a category. Now, that of course is enormously helped in a way by saying, as Barr did, as Alfred Barr did, saying that there is no relationship really between modern art and the kinds of criteria you might use to judge whether something is modern art or not, and that older notion of what art is. You know, by making this cut, which Dorner didn't do, then you can say, but now we're talking about modern art, and now the criteria are completely different. So now, a Mondrian, which is 3 lines, 4 lines on a canvas, can become modern art, because modern art says that it's art. It fulfills its own criteria, in a way. Whatever criteria it invents, it then fulfills, and that means that it becomes the thing that it says it is. It's a nice trick, it's an interesting trick, it's a trick that allows a lot of experimentation, allows of possibility, it allows tradition to be thrown out the window, but it also allows a lot of the context which we would want to talk about in the decolonial, a lot of the responsibilities to the past, the responsibilities to other people, the responsibilities to the world, the responsibilities to an environment, the responsibilities to other life forms. All those things, those idea of responsibility, of caring, of healing, those kind of go out the window, because now you're really inventing, you're busy with making things anew. And you can't be held responsible for what happened in the past, and you can't be responsible for what happens as a result of what you do. Might sound familiar, questions of science and pure science research, you know, these things are all connected. There's no separation between this thinking. But this is the modern thinking that we see exhibited in something like this. Now what we did as a little kind of play in a way, experimentation with an organisation called the Museum of American Art Berlin, which has developed much of this story. We made a copy in 2016 of exactly the same painting. And what we wanted to say is, at the beginning of this exhibition, which is all about is something art or not, is this copy art? Is it even a realist painting? Because it's a literal representation of reality. It's a little bit off here and there, but it's basically a realist representation. So what's the status of this? Can you hang this on the wall and say it's a Mondrian copy, and that it basically has the same status, it stimulates the same kind of thought processes, it fulfills a role in the narrative? Or is it that this one, with the DNA that's associated with the fact that Piet Mondrian's hand touched this, and this almost mystical idea of originality, which I'm not dismissing at all, but I'm just saying that that's the difference between these two. If you look at them, that one looks a bit newer, but other than that, these two really, this is that he touched it, and this is that somebody else touched it who we're not so interested in. But also somebody touched it, somebody painted it, a human, but not an interesting human, apparently. Yeah? No. Obviously, this original, with its aging, with its effect, it has a different status, but it's maybe not so different. If we're talking about the story of is this art, which was a question that was asked of this painting when it was painted. Yeah? When it was painted, people would say, is this art? And now, We said that's art, it's fine. Generally we say. A few people would still argue, but most people say yes. But this, no. So maybe in 70 years, 90 years, sorry, in 90 years, this becomes art. Yeah? This step is something that we still need to think about. Now, the other sculpture that I'd like to talk about here is this representation of the Virgin Mary, of Maria. And this is interesting because it's in many museums. A lot of religious objects, and that's not only Christian objects, also in ethnographic museums, many religious objects from other religions, are displayed sometimes against white walls, sometimes in context, but in ways as though it feels like a natural place for these objects to be. But to what extent does this object make sense in a museum? It was built with a very clear function. It was a functional object. It wasn't an autonomous object. It wasn't done in order to be displayed in a museum. It was done in order to help you pray. In some cases, in some non-Christian forms of religion, it would be done in order to pray to. It would be not just a representation, it would be something to pray to. But that religious function is gone. It would be, I'm not going to do it, but it would be a bit absurd if I knelt down in front of this, no? You wouldn't feel comfortable. I wouldn't feel comfortable anyway. So this function has completely disappeared. But the function has only disappeared because of its displacement into the museum. What is the museum doing here? Is it removing a function, a context, a place? Again, is it separating? Just like Alfred Barr did, is this a separation, a breaking of ties, of bonds, of responsibilities that once were there and are there no longer? And if that's so, how do we play that out in relationship to the decolonial thinking? How do we play that out in relationship to our learnings of different history lines which exist through the decolonial? I want to leave it there because I think it's a discussion. But this is the collection. This work is in our collection, this work is in our collection. This is borrowed because this isn't part of our collection because we're a modern art museum, so it doesn't belong here. But nevertheless, in its borrowing, in its presence here, it raises these questions of what are the responsibilities that we have and what are the responsibilities that the sculpture has to its original context and to its new context. And how does that chime with the question of how we understand how to decolonize ourselves, how to decolonize this collection? Let's go on. So, we're in the same room, slightly different place. It's hard because you won't have an overview of it, but this is all related to each other. And what we're looking at here is, initially, in a vitrine, a mask and hands, wooden hands, from Sumatra. Now, why Sumatra? Why a mask? Why from this particular place? Well, remember that I said at the beginning that the modern art museum, that the vanabbemuseum, was formed or shaped in a time of colonialism. I didn't just mean that in an abstract sense of it was the same time things were going around in Africa or Southeast Asia or South America that we have to deal with as a museum because they were happening at the same time. I meant it very literally. This is Mr. Vanabbe, Henri Vanabbe, the founder of our museum. And Henri Vanabbe was a tobacco merchant. And his tobacco came almost exclusively from Indonesia and from two places in Indonesia, from East Java and from Sumatra, from a place in Sumatra, Medan. Now, the plantations that are built in Sumatra, which allowed the tobacco to be built in factories in the Netherlands, are part of the Dutch imperial system as it was built from the 17th century onwards, even earlier actually, but largely from the 17th century onwards. It's part of that long story of the modern colonial system. Without this tobacco, and without the exploitation of these workers, here they are in one of the plantations drying the tobacco, without this relationship, there is no vanabbemuseum. Now you can say that about many, many institutions in Western Europe, of course, but we can literally trace it. Without these people, there is no vanabbemuseum. We call it the vanabbemuseum. We say this is our founder, but these are our founders, at least equally as much. Yeah? We're founded by what were called Dutch East Indian, Javanese, now Indonesian workers, Sumatran workers. That's where our roots come from. That's where we belong. That's part of our, if you want to call it, our origin myth. But the origin myth that we tell ourselves is all related to this man. And you will see a portrait of him later, where he looks slightly different. Here he is in Amsterdam testing the Sumatra tobacco to see if it's good enough to make the cigars that he made. It's an interesting story that when, after the Second World War, one of the conditions of the Marshall Plan was that the Netherlands and other former colonial powers, or even existing colonial powers, should stop importing tobacco from their former colonies, or their still existing colonies, and import it particularly from Virginia, but from the south of the United States. It was one of the conditions. And that tobacco was much lower quality, is much lower quality than tobacco that comes out of what's now Indonesia. So that's where the switch came between cigars, which need a good leaf and a good tobacco in order to be produced, and cigarettes. The move was made. Of course, that was a huge marketing campaign, but it was basically in order to reduce the quality of what people expected of tobacco to a level that the American tobacco would be attractive to buy. And that, of course, destroyed the vanabbemuseum industry because they were still trying to make cigars, and you know, there's the end of the vanabbe factory in Eindhoven as a result. Now again, this is a very one-sided story. Yeah? The Marshall Plan has lots and lots of consequences, but it's interesting that we're directly affected by it in that way. Vanabbe, who is actually from a Jewish origin but converts to Christianity before the Second World War and dies in 1940, has this direct link to colonialism. And then we thought, well, what is going on in Sumatra at this time? Because we have no record of it in the collection. Yeah? It's not something that's really been looked at in the history of this museum. That we could at least show or demonstrate that there is this connection and that we allow ourselves to think about it. And we went to the Museum of World Cultures in Leiden, and we found these objects from the area, at least as far as it's known. Here is the card, the registration card, from this area. Now, what's interesting about this is, of course, there are two things that are interesting about this. One, we know, without exception, the maker, the history, the provenance, as it's called, who bought it first, who bought it second, of almost every work in this collection. A few are dubious because of the history of the Second World War, but even then we know that they're dubious. This is unnamed artist, not completely sure exactly where it's from. The provenance is not clear. It's an object that ends up in a collection without really knowing where it comes from and why it comes from and who brought it there. I think who brought it there is known, but often that's not even known. They end up brought by colonialists who plunder often objects from villages and then ship them back to the imperial centre in order to demonstrate their success in a way as colonialists. That's what you do as a colonialist, no? You grab objects and you steal them and you send them back. It's like the pirate treasure chest. So this story belongs to this object. One of the interesting things, I think, and this shows you how far we have to go in decolonizing ourselves, is that we've had this for about 3 years, and it's only in the last 6 months that we really started to ask questions about this object. Like, what is the dance of death which is associated with? Who are the peoples, and how do they, in Medan, how might they relate to this object now? What more can we find out about it? Can we give a context for this object which is different from our modern context of it being a colonial object related to Henri van Abbe? Because this isn't made for Henri van Abbe, yeah? I mean, some objects were made for tourists, but probably this isn't made for Henri van Abbe, certainly, and maybe not for a tourist. It's made in the same spirit as the Maria the Maria sculpture, the Virgin Mary sculpture around the corner. It's made in that same spirit, as part of a ceremony, as part of a possibility to access something at the metaphysical level. And it's interesting, it's taken us 2 years of having this thing, this person in a way, this representation of a person, representation of a god perhaps, in our museum to become curious enough to ask those questions. And I think that shows you then how much our mindsets have to change, how far we have to go before we can in any way think that we're on a track of decolonizing. But the other interesting aspect of this, and the other point about the reason to demodernize, alongside decolonialize, which is the core, to demodernize, is because not only does this represent this story of Vanabbe tobacco and Sumatra, it also represents another story, a story of modern art. Because where does the influence of the pictorial language of modern art come from? Or where is it often attributed to? Where do the artists themselves, Picasso and Braque, attribute it to? They attribute it to precisely the ethnographic collections that are drawn in from the French colonies particularly, and shown together in Paris, in certain museums in Paris, in Trocadero is the first place where they go to, in the early 20th century. They're going there, they're looking at it, they're seeing these forms, they're copying, let's say copying these forms, they're claiming them as their own. They are their own, because they're not exactly the same. They're not like the Mondrian copy, but they are very close, in some cases very, very close. And they're making this into the history of modern art. Modern art, this separate category, is relying on, is leaning on this very history, which comes out through the colonial plunder that's then transported to a city like Paris. And it's interesting that this is known right from, we could say, not necessarily the origins of modernism, because we might trace that back to 1848, but from the origins of the modern art museum as a story. Even before that, this story is known. What we have here is documentation of an exhibition in 1912 where modern art was shown alongside what are called, first exhibited, I excuse the word, but Negro objects. Now that's written here, that's why so it's a quotation. It was shown alongside those objects. And what's interesting about this is that story has been repeated and repeated and repeated and never developed. It stayed. Oh, that's where some of the origins were, and that's where modernism comes from, and now let's get on and tell the story of modern art. Because what's really interesting is that most of those objects, like this object, are not some antiques that come from 500 years before and are dug up like our sculptures of Julius II, dug up by these white archaeologists who come and find these objects. They're being made by people in Congo, in West Africa, at that moment. You know, it sounds banal, but I can't help thinking that all it would take to know who this person from Sumatra who made this, to know what his name is, all it would have taken was the colonialist to ask, what's your name? And if we'd never asked Picasso what his name was, we would be in the same situation. It's the way that these things were registered, here's the registration, the way these things were registered, the way these things were thought of. The mindset, the modern mindset, and I think this is, in a way, certainly as modern as it is colonial, this modern mindset to understand progress as not having to take account of the consequences of these objects or their provenance, but having to take consequence of the provenance of other kinds of objects. And that's the process that I think we need to go through in demodernizing our collection, in decolonializing our collection, is through this process of discovery of precisely what these relationships might mean for us today. I'm not even very interested in reconstructing the past. It's about what these relationships mean for us today in the world where we're trying desperately to decolonize ourselves, to battle the racism which is raging at the moment, the patriarchy, and the capitalism, which are all part of the same system, that are built into our DNA, into the foundations of an institution like this. So we were talking in this room about how art becomes art, how it's made art, and I want to give you a couple of examples of art that stopped being art. And stopped being art not because it changed as an object, but because its history changed, its relationship to its context changed. So here is a painting by an artist called Otto Arndt. And Otto Arndt was a favourite painter, one of the favourite painters, there were many, but one of the favourite painters of Adolf Hitler, the leader of the National Socialist Party in Germany in the 30s and 40s. Now, this painting is believed to have been in his own private collection. It was a vast collection, so I'm not saying he hung it above his fireplace, but it was in his own private collection. We have an image here of him standing next to an Otto Arndt in the Great German Exhibition in Munich, which was one of the defining exhibitions of National Socialist aesthetic value done in 1937. So we see a kind of direct relationship. To cut a long story short, after the Second World War, this stops being a favourite of the regime, of the government, of the state, and doesn't even qualify as art anymore. Even though it has many more attributes of art, you would say, in the traditional sense, than the Mondrian that we looked at. It goes to the German Historical Museum, not to the art museums. It goes there, and it's in a cellar, in a warehouse, until we find it, nobody wanted it, and we brought it here. It's still in the ownership of the German Historical Museum, but they keep on loaning it to us for 3 years, seemingly relatively happy. Now, this is no longer then art, at least in terms of its classification. We can make our own subjective judgment, we can make a subjective judgment about anything and say it's art. But art also becomes art because institutions recognize it as such. So this was art and stops being art. And then we can look at it and we can say, how do we feel about this? How does this categorization, which is determining, as we've seen from Alfred Bach, of what modern art is, how does this categorization read to us? And I want to give you another example, because there's another example from Germany which is very similar. This is a painting by Gerhard Bonzin that was painted in 1961 in Germany. He was born in 1930, so he was a child, young adult in the war. This was painted about the reconstruction of Berlin on the socialist side of the war. In 1989, so we could say when the Second World War finally ended, more or less, in 1989, this painting went into the same collection as that painting. It went into the German Historical Museum. It was no longer art. This was seen to be a problematic painting because it depicted an ideology, just like that one, actually much more boldly, much more straightforwardly. It's harder to find the National Socialism in that without really understanding the aesthetics of National Socialism. Here you can see much more the socialist aesthetics or communist aesthetics or Socialist Unity Party, SED it's called, the SED party's aesthetics in this because it's about reconstruction, it's workers, you can see this quite clearly demonstrated in this painting. But this stops being art again. So these categories of art, not art, becoming and unbecoming, is something which very much belongs to how to maintain the modern art tradition. Because as the modern art tradition gets rewritten, overwritten, and extended in this timeline, this chronology, as that all happens, then things from the past can pop up as embarrassments or problems or questions. And in that process of popping up as embarrassments and problems and questions, they also get excluded and recategorized. So we don't have to worry about them anymore. And finally, I'll show you one of the pearls, one of the big jewels in the treasure chest of the vanabbemuseum, the pirate's treasure chest of the vanabbemuseum, is the Picasso painting Women on Greek, Femme en Vert. And this painting was bought in the 1950s by the then director A very sort of inspiring move to say that this Van Abbe Museum should become a modern art museum. And in order to become a modern art museum, it needs to have a collection which represents the story that Alfred Barr told in the 1930s of what modern art is. So taking that story from the victors in the Second World War, also as a way, if you take that story, you can kind of forget about all that other stuff and those other stories that existed during the Second World War in the Netherlands. Yeah? It's a way of cleaning it out. You don't have to make continuities, you can make a break. Make a break, take this story from elsewhere, bring it here, and then make it ours. And so this is a way of making the story ours. What's interesting is even then in the 1950s, that gesture, which you might think, God, everybody would embrace it. Yeah, it makes complete sense. Let's forget about all our complicity with National Socialism and all that nonsense about the European old religion and everything like that. Yeah? Let's forget all about that and the aesthetics of that. Let's embrace this. But actually, there were huge protests against buying this painting. And here are some of the clippings, the press clippings from that time. There was even a protest march organised in Eindhoven to ask the city council not to give my predecessor, one of the directors, Eddie de Wilde, the money in order to buy this painting. He won. The story, the narrative of modern art won. Now everybody looks at that and feels a bit embarrassed for the people that protested against it. Yeah, probably not a good thing to do. Yeah, it strengthens the position of the director, because they say, obviously directors knew something that other people didn't. They knew that this was valuable. It gives me a certain leverage over the city council by saying, look, once this happens, that maybe what we're doing now, you also should be careful. But God knows whether that will be true or not. That's another question. But nevertheless, this narrative, this story of this painting is part of the history of how modern art became modern in the Van Abbe Museum. And now I'm going to take you to a couple of rooms which show two versions of modern art which struggled for each other for a while in the 30s and 40s, and then ultimately came out with the victory of the modern story that we know from Alfred Barr at the beginning. So, we've come into two rooms which actually, in a rather different way, look at what that modern art, particularly in that year 1936, when this museum, Van Abbe Museum, was founded, when Alexander Dorner went to the United States, and when the first works were bought for this exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art, in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So 1936 is this year where somehow everything comes together. For a moment, they all coexisted at this moment of struggle, of what could happen. Alexander Dorner going to America with his ideas, can he make them work? Barr thinking, also having come back from socialist Russia, thinking about how we can introduce a sort of socialist modernism into the United States, thinking about his relationship to the collectors, to the super rich of his day, and Van Abbe thinking about how he could make this city a little bit more civilized, let's say, a little bit more aesthetically attuned by opening a museum and donating part of his collection to it. That was or selling actually, to the City Council part of his collection. That was the process that was going on in this year, 1936. And I want to talk about this diagram, because this diagram is actually on the cover, we can see it in one of the vitrines, of the book of the exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art. And this I can probably talk about for 2 hours, so I'm not going to do that. But I want to make, I've made some points. Here you see a timeline, yeah? Here you see progress, here you see the arrows. Remember the timeline with the arrow at the end? Here you have them. You have all the qualities of the modern, as Julius in a way invented them, largely unconsciously I think, but also, maybe, we never know. Yeah? But nevertheless, all those qualities are here in this diagram. Aesthetically we can read it in those terms. But I want to pause for a moment from that and point out something very interesting about it in relationship to the decolonial. Because amongst this drawing, which includes the names of artists, includes the names of movements like Neo-Impressionism, Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Constructivism, all these things that we've heard about, yeah? All these things that are, if you're interested at all in modern art, are quite familiar. That this also includes a number of red boxes, red rectangles, with what I imagine Barr saw, because Barr drew this personally, Imagine Basel as influences on these movements. Yeah? Things from outside, things that are in a way unconnected to art or to modern art, but are things that modern artists see in order to make the work that they do. Now, what are these things that they see in order to make the work that they do? What are these influences that come into them? In the 1890s, Japanese prints, early 1900s, Near Eastern art. In the middle, and again, it's just apologies for the word, Negro sculpture. And below, in 1910 or so, machine aesthetic. These are the words, Japanese prints, Near Eastern art, Negro sculpture, machine aesthetic, which are the sort of ingredients in this. That's how I read it, yeah? The ingredients which, together with the genius of the artists, form the possibility of the modern art that we're talking about here. Now, this is a modern art that begins in 1890. That's a very limited view of modern art if we think about Julius II, our argument of how modernity is constructed within the museum field. But here, you see these four influences, these four red blocks, as acknowledging precisely this relationship to the colonial while still keeping it separate, yeah? In these four boxes. And what's interesting to notice is that one of the boxes is called machine aesthetic, which apparently has to do with industrialization, not to do with colonialism, and quite probably does, certainly in his thinking. But what it means is that this machine aesthetic is about objects produced by workers in factories. Yeah? Because machines are built in factories and then populated in factories that produce more machines. Yeah? Machines produce machines. So this machine aesthetic is this idea that there are some producers, but these producers are workers. These producers are people that have a different kind of status from the artists. So then when we go to Negro sculpture, to Near Eastern art, to Japanese prints, who are the people who produce those? What is their status on this map? How do we, in seeing this diagram, the diagram that we inherit in this institution, the diagram which is represented in this room by paintings that are by artists who are on this plan, how do we understand these people and these cultures which are represented in those boxes? And let me go one stage further. So that sees the separation, which is a fantasy. Yeah? So even this acknowledges that separation is a fantasy and still makes it. It says, well, it doesn't really exist, but nevertheless, we're going to draw the line. And we're going to say this, art, this, workers, products. But actually, no. Not when you look at it in another way. So this decolonial might be opening up these boxes, but it's far more complicated than that. I wish it was that easy. But just imagine if you are, let's say in the 1950s, say after the Second World War. So after, when processes of decolonization, not decolonial, are underway in the 1960s. If you're an artist from Lebanon, if you're a sculptor from the Congo, if you're a Japanese printmaker, how do you write yourself into this map when this map is, not to put too fine a point on it, the Bible of the museums of modern art that you want to get into? How can you get out of that box if you're already put in that box? What do you need to do? Well, the answer is, as we look at the modern times, you need to move to New York after the war, before to Paris, and you need to assimilate. You need to pretend to be somebody who belongs in the black lines and not in the red lines. You can't take the red lines with you. You have to become black rather than red in order to fit in. And there are many examples of that. I won't go into it, but we could talk about that. But that process and this inclusion, I want to also say something absolutely in Alfred Barr's favour and to his credit, that there were many kinds of schemas. Actually, we have some over there, other kinds of plans. We can maybe go over there. So we've come actually just over to where all the diagrams are, all the different kinds of diagrams of modern art are. And there's even one here written by my predecessor, Eddie de Wilde, to show what the collection of the vanabbemuseum should be, very much based on, this is the original drawing that Alfred Barr did, a copy of it obviously, the original drawing that Alfred Barr did, which got turned into the book cover. So all these drawings, the only one that ever recognized this relationship while still making the separation, because it was impossible, I think, for him not to do, but the fact that he recognized this relationship was Alfred Barr and was in this diagram. So the diagrams by Eddie de Wilde, the diagrams from the Soviet Union, the diagrams from France, all these drawings don't mention this influence, don't mention these red boxes at all. So the fact that he's even thinking about this is something that because it gives us the tools, you have to understand what exclusion and exclusion, what silences, what refusals are going on in the shaping, making of modern art. It helps us to see that because he saw it. But he saw it in his way, and we see it in our way. But this, I think, is an enormously important diagram because it allows us to understand precisely when and how the cut is made. And that's, I think, to make connection, to heal the wounds, as Rolando would talk about, to heal the wounds. This is a wound, this cut. And healing it is part of the process of our own personal and institutional decolonization, decolonial thinking. Let's go through to the other room where we'll see a different form of modernism, one of these other forms of modernism that was competing. Now, we've looked at that history of the Museum of Modern Art and that drawing of the Cubism and Abstract Art exhibition. And I want us here to go to another world, that other world of Alexander Dorner, because here is the Raum der Gegenwart of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. That is a copy without original. It's a copy of something that was never built. Actually, we have two copies in the collection, which is a long story, but nevertheless, this is one of the copies that we have. And this copy is produced because the design was made in 1930, and it was fairly meticulously designed by Moholy-Nagy, and those drawings exist. So this can be reconstructed. It was designed in 1930, and it couldn't be built. There wasn't the money in the financial crisis of the early 1930s in Germany. Then the National Socialists came to power, as I say, in 1932 in Hanover, and then the money wasn't available anyway. And although Dorner stayed until 1936, it was very hard times. So this room was never built, but we still can build it. So what we see here is a different kind of what we could call modern art, a radically different kind of modern art, the kind of modern art that Barr was proposing. At least visually. It's a representation which is very different from the representations that we saw, quite classical representations of the Museum of Modern Art exhibition, Cubism and Abstract Art. It's a representation of what Dorner might even call the end of art, the transformation of art in that period of the early 20th century into media. So what you have in this room are photography. You have movement. These things can move. Documentary comes into it. You have slideshows, Dias, if you remember slides at all, or know what they are. You have 8mm, 16mm film being shown in this room. You have a work by Moholy-Nagy itself that's a dynamic artwork that moves, that changes. You have this idea both of movement with the film, with the Moholy-Nagy artwork, and of time and documentary being encoded into this room. It's like saying art has become media, and what was the purpose of art in that long history, which goes all the way back to the prehistorical. Remember that Dorner had this story of art going all the way through, and that prehistorical work, those, if you like, paintings on the inside of cave walls, that has become this in our society. This is a very different story, very different story of modernity and the modern than the one that we might think about from Alfred Barr. And this is why I think it's so interesting to be here. Now, what we've done here is to put three key, in a way, moments in that construction of 20th century modernity in the Paris International Exhibition of 1937, the New York World's Fair, as it was called, International Exhibition of 1939, and the post-war fair in Brussels in 1958, which was the first post-war International World's Fair. So what you have is these three moments where you have these ideologies, capitalism, National Socialism, the Soviet Union and communism battling against each other. The National Socialism is gone by 1958, of course, but these three and then later two ideologies battling against each other in symbolic terms, fighting for space, fighting for the right to dominate, fighting for the right to be, in some senses, the inheritor of the colonial mentality, the colonial mindset. This is what you have in these three World's Fairs, and one of them, very significantly, the Guernica painting of Picasso, which becomes a symbol of art's engagement with the world, in a certain sense, art's engagement with politics. So this is what happens. We've chosen to put these here. Obviously, this could never have been done because not only was the room never built, but it would have been, if it had been built, it would have been closed down in the 1930s. So this exhibition is a complete fantasy, and the room is a complete fantasy. All of this is as much of a fantasy as the Mondrian copy that we saw at the beginning, and as much of an authentic and valid reconstruction or construction of what modernity could represent, and how demodernizing these positions is how I think we can deal with the collection that we have now. But maybe we can talk more about the question of modernity when we have a discussion. And we come to another room here, which is the room of the Vanabbe collection when it started in 1936. So this was modern art in the eyes of not only Vanabbe, but let's say for a moment Eindhoven City Council, the people's representatives, who bought this work in order to have a museum of modern art. So this represents another kind of modernity. Now, maybe your first reaction, because of what we've learned from Alfred Barr, not what we've learned today from Alfred Barr, what we've learned for years from Alfred Barr, is to say, oh, yeah, this is a bit bourgeois, a bit, for your living room, not really challenging, not really new, not really innovative, yeah? Not really creative, all those words that neoliberalism instrumentalized in its capitalism. Yeah? It's not really doing all those things that modern art meant to do, not challenging, not provoking. And of course, that's true. In one way, that's true. But what's interesting is when you look at it from the point of view of the cuts that are made, then there's something in this collection and in these works which actually is a little bit different. Take this painting of Kid Oliveira, who's a boxer from Suriname, colony of the Netherlands, who comes in the 1920s and 30s and fights, or 1930s more, and is in the Netherlands and stays in the Netherlands for all that period. He's actually born in the Netherlands, but from Surinamese roots. I'm getting the story slightly wrong. This is one of the few people of colour that are represented in our collection until very, very recently. One of the few people that speaks to that colonial heritage in a direct way. One of the few evidences in the collection of the colonial connections between Suriname and the Netherlands that we have talked about. This is him. There was a beautiful project that was done by a number of people of colour, of black activists and artists in the Netherlands, where they took Kid Oliveira on a journey through the museum to meet all the other paintings. Because for a long time, I have to say, he was in the basement, because he wasn't considered to be that modern art. And so then he came out a few years ago, and he had a little trip around the museum to meet everybody else that was in here, which was an amazing experience, an amazing performance. It was called Why Am I Here? And I can see him asking that question, really, amongst these stories. Why was he here from 1936 onwards? Kind of undervalued, forgotten. And as a painting, in all those questions of aesthetic value, in all those questions of modernist creativity, of course it's not that striking, it's not particularly interesting. But in all those questions that we might ask it now, trying to decolonize ourselves, trying to decolonize the collection, this becomes super interesting. It's not only him that's in the collection, but also, and I'm going to say in passing, this is the formal portrait of Henri van Abbe that we have. Actually, it's not in the collection, it's on loan, because we don't have it in the collection, which is an interesting point, yeah? But nevertheless, I'm very proud that we have it here, and this is the person who made this all possible. This is the tobacco manufacturer, and his family came in and they thought they knew all the portraits, and they didn't know this one, so it was a kind of discovery that we made, is always also rather nice, in that modernist sense of wanting to discover things. You know? You see, it's so much in the DNA. And here is another portrait in the Van Abbe collection of a Javanese dancer. Now this is another story like the Sumatran sculpture, like the Sumatran death mask, where this has been studied, painted by a quite well-known early modernist Dutch artist, Isaac Israels. And again, this has been in the collection since 1936, has always been called Javanese dancer, and has kind of, again, been a little bit forgotten until we brought it up. One of the interesting things, how you learn, because we've been working, of course, of this heritage, because we are from what is now Indonesia as much as we're from Eindhoven in many ways, as an institution. We are here because of what happened there. We've been working quite a lot with Indonesian artists, with Indonesian critics, with Indonesian curators. And one of the people that came here, he's living in the Netherlands, and he said, but I know who this is. I know who this person is. I know the history of this person. And this was a famous dancer who was in the Netherlands for quite some time. There's a gamelan orchestra in the back, you can see. And this was quite a known figure who was anonymous here. So now we're obviously, like the Sumatran death mask, we're investigating that whole history and trying to tell that history to give him back a kind of identity and a kind of history, and hopefully in the next presentation. But again, he's been hanging here in this room since 2017, and it's only in the last 9 months that we've really started to follow up that history. So there you see the relationships that are emerging just by hanging these works on the wall, by looking at them, by thinking about them, by living with them. Then things start to emerge which could never otherwise have emerged. And histories start to be told, histories start to unfold. And that for me is interesting. So this collection, which is seen to be, certainly in terms of market value, but also in terms of art historical value, to be much lower in traditional terms than the room we just came from, the Museum of Modern Art room. Actually, this, in terms of our thinking processes around decoloniality, even in terms of our thinking process around decolonial aesthesis, that these become far more significant objects in the collection than could ever be imagined if you didn't change your stance, change your perspective. So what happens is that things fade and things come forward. Yeah? Things move around, things float. And this process of doing that in the name of decolonizing ourselves is, I think, something that's very challenging, very disruptive, but also amazingly inspiring. And I think at that point we should perhaps finish, and we should hopefully talk more. There's lots more of the exhibition. Perhaps I'll show you some later on if we have a chance, but otherwise I can talk about it later. Thank you very much.